Good afternoon. I'm Gilda Barabino. I currently serve as president of Olin College of Engineering, and I'm so pleased to be serving as moderator along with my colleague, Ann Reed. We welcome you to our session, Systemic Racism in Science, the Shadow of Slavery. The centuries-long legacy of the enslavement of Black Americans infects our society and threatens our health and well-being. Structural policies and practices that continue to limit opportunities for Blacks ensure persistent inequities and perpetuate the legacy. Science is not immune and must examine its own past and current role as it charts its path for a future characterized by a more just and equitable society. We have a distinguished group of panelists with us today who will speak to the social and political aspects of science rooted in racism, cast in the inescapable shadow of slavery. You will hear from each of them following my brief introductions. Their presentations will be followed by a discussion period led by Ann Reed. Now for the introductions. First, Willie Pearson Jr. is a professor of sociology in the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Institute of Technology. Prior to Georgia Tech, Dr. Pearson held appointments at Wake Forest University and Wake Forest University School of Medicine. As an expert on science and technology policy, science and engineering workforce, and underrepresented groups, he is frequently called upon to advise the National Science Foundation and the National Academies. And in 2010, he was appointed by President Obama to the Presidential Advisory Board of the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. He's the author and co-editor of 8 books and monographs, including the forthcoming book with Vijay Reddy, entitled Social Justice and Education for the 21st Century. Joining Dr. Pearson is Inobong, also known as Anna Branch. She's the Senior Vice President for Equity and Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University. Prior to joining Rutgers, Dr. Branch served as Associate Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer, and a Professor of Sociology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She conducts research on labor and work that explores the historical roots and contemporary underpinnings of racial and gender inequality. She's the author of the new book, Black in America, The Paradox of the Color Line, as well as the editor of Pathways, Potholes, and Persistence of Women in Science, Reconsidering the Pipeline, and the author of Opportunity Denied, Limiting Black Women to Devalued Work. And rounding out our panel, Joseph Graves Jr. is a professor of biological sciences at North Carolina A&T University. Prior to North Carolina A&T, Dr. Graves held appointments at Arizona State University and the University of California, Irvine. His research concerns the evolutionary genomics of adaptation, and he has written extensively on biological concepts of race in humans. His work has been featured in documentary films and a number of television programs, including CNN's Anderson Cooper 360 program and PBS's Master Series. His books on the biology of race are entitled The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, and forthcoming, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Race, but Were Afraid to Ask. And this is co-authored with Alan Goodman. It's a great panel. I now cede the platform to Dr. Pearson.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about some structural issues today. In particular, I'm going to try to stay on time. Next slide, please. Today's presentation is focusing exclusively on African Americans. And my reason for doing so is because of the historical and contemporary barriers to this population. And I'm going to focus almost exclusively on science and engineering doctorates, because that's what I've specialized in for my 30-plus career. Next slide, please. It's been nearly a century and a half of the presence of African American PhDs in science. Yet, even to this date, the scholarly literature has continued to neglect this population, so we know very little about the presence and career experiences of African American PhD scientists. Many years ago, John Slaughter, who was then the director of the National Science Foundation, talked about trying to increase the scholarly literature on Blacks in engineering. Unfortunately, almost 30 years passed because John became president of the University of Maryland. Later on, head of NACME, I became involved in a lot of advisor committees. So we never got a chance. So about 30 years passed, and then we had a chance to talk again. So we had assumed that actually a whole lot had been done in terms of chronicling the experiences of African American scientists. Sadly, that was not the case. So we decided to go forth with our project. And we were very fortunate that Utah of Stevens Institute of Technology agreed to work with us. And so this was the first scholarly book published on the topic, and it was Changing the Face of Science, and specifically focused on African American engineers. Next slide, please. Robert K. Merton, who is actually the founder of my field, sociology of science, commented very early on that restricting scientific careers in any fashion is actually problematical because it ends up, in a sense, limiting the talent pool. Next slide, please. So the issue is that, and I think we've heard that before, that science is supposed to be not only objective, but inclusive of all individuals who want to participate in the scientific community. Well, there's also the issue of the ethos of science. It may be that looking and accepting all talent is part of the ethos, but what we know is that sometimes the ethos of science collides with the reality of society. Next slide, please. So this presentation is going to focus not so much on individual encounters with racism and discrimination, but primarily on structural or institutional issues. I want to point out from the very outset that this does not misconsider or not consider the devastating impact of individual racism on Blacks who have been in science and engineering. I know that my colleagues in the history of science, Evelyn Hammonds and Ken Manning, have done considerable works about individual racism and the narratives of some professional organizations, including AAAS. What I would like to do is to point out that these levels of racism have a devastating impact not only on the mental health, but also the physical health of people doing the science. Next slide, please. I want to focus on four major themes in the interest of time. Next slide, please. One is the career experiences, and I'm drawing much of this on over 100 interviews with both African American and non-African American scientists, and surveys of almost 1,000 PhD scientists in engineering, again, Blacks as well as other populations. But I'm going to focus today on African Americans. One of the things that comes up consistently in the interviews and in the survey responses has to do with the reward system. And this particular reward system, all of you know what it is. The major concerns have been the kind of invisibility or the lack of transparency on how our rewards are assigned. In this particular case, there's been considerable concern over the years that the work of African American scientists and engineers tends to be devalued. That is their research specialty. This is particularly the case in the social behavior and economic sciences, where the notion is that Black people working on Black issues cannot be objective for a lot of reasons. I think the main thing here is that having a research specialty and being committed to that, but yet finding reviewers don't particularly value your research. What I want to speak to next is this question about the invisibility of criteria for certain kinds of rewards and recognition. Consistently, there's the response that the peer review process, whether it's for grants, whether it's for publication, is highly flawed, but it's also a major barrier to participation and the reward system for African Americans in science. Another issue that comes up is that there is this kind of lack of transparency, a lack of understanding how people become appointed as an IPA. And I'll just say, for example, that federal mission agencies like NSF reviewed from the African American interviews suggest that they know that people can become an IPA, but they don't necessarily know what is the process, how one not only applies, but how you get selected. It's pointed out consistently, one of the major problems is that a lot of the Blacks who end up being IPAs tend to be in the education side, but very few in the research directorates. So this is also seen as another barrier because one has a limited understanding of how the agency works and how proposal criteria actually laid out. I think another one that seemed to be very problematic and seen as a barrier is how does one become a member of an advisory committee or an advisory board in the scientific and engineering community. And so part of this issue is that there's the whole process that people see that these are honorific boards, whether it's American Chemical Society, whether it's any other scientific group, but yet very few Blacks tend to be on the advisory boards, and even fewer on some of the particular committees that advise in science and engineering. So it's seen as a major barrier in the sense that it's also a lack of recognition, but even people who have done well tend not to get on those particular advisory committees. I think the other thing that seems to come up on a very consistent basis in terms of structural issues is professional recognition. And again, there is this issue about transparency in the sense of how does one even apply, be recognized, even when one has done very credible research, whether it's publication, grants, programs. And particularly, how do you become a fellow? And a fellow, whether it's of the scientific organization or a fellow of AAAS or similar kind of fellows, what's the process? Why is it that so few Blacks have actually become fellows? More importantly, it comes up where that if you begin to look at the National Academy, why is it that there's so few Blacks in the National Academy, and those who are, why are they concentrated in engineering and medicine, even though they are scientists? So the next issue is why there's a situation where there's a women's committee at the National Academy, but there's not a committee that deals with issues of minorities. Next slide, please. Here are some representative quotes. I won't read them to you, I'll just have them to be flashed. And so part of it, the issue is that you can read it for yourself, that this has been consistent, whether it's industry, whether it's government, whether it's the academic community. Next slide, please. Here's another one that's representative of the research over the years. And again, this is the issue of who gets what in terms of research projects. I think this one may speak to the issue of industry. Next one, please. So here is the issue that I want to speak about in terms of historically Black colleges and universities. And my colleagues may also address this issue. I selected this as a major theme for a particular reason that historically Black colleges have a long and storied history of contributing to the scientific and engineering workforce, but also for other reasons as well. And I'd like to point out, despite potential of these kind of collaborations, they're called partnerships. Some of the federal agencies have these, some of the private foundations have these, where that a research university would collaborate with a historically Black school in this case. And so one thing that's been talked about quite a bit when I've interviewed the faculty at HBCUs and even those at majority institutions, that these particular partnerships or collaborations are sometimes almost forced, but they have considerable potentiality in the sense that it works both ways, for that the HBCU faculty and the faculty at major research universities are learning from each other. And the whole goal is try to not only advance science through innovation, but to also produce the next generation of scholars. One of the major complaints of the barrier is that faculty members at HBCUs point out that sometimes the partnerships tend to be very one-sided, with people at majority research institutions seeing themselves as mentors to the faculty at HBCUs. And here's what the argument is, that the faculty at HBCUs point out they've gone to the similar kind of universities, sometimes the same universities, and they don't need someone who's at a major research university treating them like a graduate student or postdoc, that they are qualified and the relationship should be equal, not an unequal partnerships. So some of the partnerships have been positive and worked out, but that's a major complaint that seems to go about. Another one seemed to be focused on the fact of the money, that too often the majority institution gets the publications, gets most of the overhead, but it should be a change in this as a major barrier. Another one is the complaint about the peer review system. And I will say that this is a more global issue, but in particular for HBCUs, the peer review bias they talk about is when they get reviews on their proposals, there seems to be this constant issue about the lack of the infrastructure to carry out the work. The quality of the faculty may not have the expertise to carry out the proposed research. And I think the issue is that there is this issue that this is a major barrier because what's being proposed is actually doable and it's relevant to what the scholars at the HBCUs want to do. The other thing they point out that there is a little bit more success when it comes down to getting proposals funded for workshops, for conferences, and if it deals with, I guess in a sense, non-basic research, they argue. And so the complaint is that the way the review system is set up, they have a major disadvantage even when they're proposing something that they believe is high quality, relevant to their populations. But here again, they suggest that most of the money that they can get is concentrated in special programs at federal agencies, less so at private foundations. And what they are suggesting here is that it's unfortunate that they've had very limited success in the research directorates. Another thing they point out is that despite all of these criticisms that they have inadequate infrastructure, the faculty quality is an issue because they have heavy teaching loads, they do not get the recognition that they deserve. And here's what they're talking about, that even with these limitations, even with the limited resources, they have been a major provider of producing African-American students who go on to get their PhDs in STEM fields. And yet they seem to get little credit for this. The majority institution that produces the PhD gets the credit, but they're complaining that there are barriers where when there are proposals submitted, they should get some recognition, the fact that they're doing something other than just teaching. They actually are producing research and talent pool. Next slide, please. The next theme deals with Black women. And I think there may be some more discussion about this later on, so I won't spend too much time. But for me, this is very important because it's a significant barrier in science and engineering. And we're talking about here the combination of racism and sexism. And I want to be clear that these Black women who have increasingly been the ones who are getting PhDs among African Americans, it's still the issue that they don't do as well in terms of being earning doctorates in engineering and physical sciences, but it's not because of their ability. There are other structural reasons. What I want to point out that regardless of whether it's an HBCU or majority institution, these issues seem to come to the surface. That is, African American women are challenged to get tenure, And even if they manage to get tenure, they end up being stuck at the associate professor level and find it very difficult to move beyond that. In industry, a similar kind of parallel. Government, something similar, where they tend to have very serious difficulties or barriers moving to more senior level positions. And so it's not surprising that some who do make it, they are kind of relegated to certain kinds of institutions. And while the men, for example, are more likely to become a dean or a president of a major research institution, but the women seem to have a different situation. And even in academia, the number who actually end up being deans or provosts or vice president for research, whether it's HBCUs or not, seem to have a major barrier moving beyond that. There have been some progress, but the issue is we need to have a better understanding of why these barriers persist, and especially for these particular women who are both Black and have the academic expertise and research expertise to actually do well. As a result of some of their experiences, an increasing number of these women actually leave the STEM fields and go into non-research positions, specifically going into outreach, going into issues that deal with diversity. And the main thing here is we need folks in all of those areas as well. But we also have an issue where if people have a commitment to research and then they find that these barriers and structures prevent them, then that's a problematic situation that needs to be dealt with. Next slide, please. This is just a couple of quotes. We're going to see how Black women are responding to this, being Black and female. Next slide, please. This is kind of what I spoke to, is that the sexism in particular pervades the different kinds of institutions, including industry. Next slide, please. I want to kind of wrap up towards the end with programs and policies. And in particular, I have a strong interest because I was a congressional fellow. But I see that some of the programs have been developed for intervention purposes. Unfortunately, a disproportionate number of those programs have never been evaluated, and especially by a third party. And yet we see the proliferation of these programs, but we see very little movement in terms of the number of Blacks who are getting degrees, especially doctoral degrees. The other thing we have is that the leadership and accountability. And here again, there is a question about transparency. And in particular, how does one become on these committees in the first place? But here's what they're talking about. A number of these individuals have participated in COV's, Committee of Visitors, at NSF and related things at other agencies. Yet they suggest that here's a case where they go back the next cycle, they see the same reports, the same issue about a lack of diversity, and then it continues, but nothing ever happens. That's what they're talking about. They seem to go into a dark hole somewhere and no one knows what's happening with these. The other point is that there is a committee at the National Science Foundation, which is a congressionally mandated committee, CIOS. But a lot of the Blacks in the community have no idea what that committee actually does and how do you get on it and what's the kind of deliverable for that committee. The last one I just want to point out is the data challenges. And here there is the issue where that trying to have an understanding of the status of Blacks in science and engineering. This is fraught with some other challenges, structural challenges, because race cannot be used on the proposals, but there are also other issues in terms of limitations of collecting data to show what the actual representation happens to be. One I would point out is that the National Center for Science and Engineering and Statistics is a very valuable resource. They may not have enough staff that they need or the resources, but they deserve a much higher recognition than what they get, given the resources, and they have great leadership there. I think the other one that we could see is that there continues to be a lack of information or studies on the longitudinal type studies on the careers of African Americans. So even to this date, we have these issues about how many, but we are pressed to find out what kind of experiences African Americans are having in their careers. Next slide and final slide. The main thing I want to leave with, because time is running out, is sustainability. We have these issues where that time after time, societal events occur, then there's a reaction. When Emmett Till was killed, there was a reaction. When we began to have the kids killed at the Birmingham bombing, then we have another issue where that something happens. Then we fast forward where that the death of George Floyd, now we have a proliferation of meetings and sessions on Blacks, and then nothing happens. And so part of this is that we have another issue where that there are more reactionary issues than proactive. So we need to remove some of these barriers. We can't just react when there's a societal event that occurs. We need to be ahead of the game because we already know what some of the problems are. So we do have some promising policies and practices, but we also know the issue about being underrepresented is a moral issue. That particular idea, mantra, seem to have not been sufficient to move the needle in terms of removing some of the barriers. The last two things I would say is that leadership, we've seen leadership at the institutional level, we've seen it at some of the federal mission agencies, we've seen at foundations, we've seen it at some companies. But sometimes when those leaders who are progressive leave or retire, their policies and programs tend to go away. So it's been suggested that one of the things that needs to happen, follow the money, and then see if there's a threat to the bottom line, seem to be the only way of getting change. Last slide, please. This is what I'd like to leave you with, because this was consistent. And I think you'll hear from my colleagues that there has been some progress, albeit it has been particularly slow at the PhD level. But one thing that occurred out of all of these interviews and all of these surveys, that the individuals love their science. They love the beauty of their science, the beauty of the engineering. They also love the promise that their discipline have, but not only for equity, but for innovation and making life much better, much healthier for everybody. But they also are disappointed that institutional barriers limit their full participation in the scientific and engineering communities. And the bottom line for them is that they love the science, but it's sometimes not the science itself. It's the human dimension that limit the full participation of these groups to be able to make a significant contribution to science and engineering. Thank you. I tried to stay on time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pearson. We appreciate you drawing our attention to institutional and structural barriers. And now we'd like to turn to Dr. Branch.
Good afternoon. I am delighted to be with you today. I want to extend my thanks to Gilda Barbino and Ann Reed and my panelist peers for inviting me today. We're going to have a great conversation. I'm truly looking forward to it, and I'm so pleased to follow Dr. Pearson, because in many ways our conversations truly build on one another, enabling us to have a continuous conversation. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and get right into it. All right, excellent. Hopefully we're all set to go and you can see me. All right, so the talk I'm going to share with you today is Racism is the Problem. Potholes and detours on the road to success for Black women in computing. Just to give you a sense of where we're going. We're going to start out with a conversation about broadening participation. Switch to a kind of sociological grounding and racial frames. I want to introduce the concept of the road to you as an alternative to the pipeline, offer some illustrations for computing. We discussed a moment ago about engineering concretely. And I want to offer you computing, switching fields for a moment, as a field to consider with very similar patterns. And then finally, we're going to talk about understanding agency and constraint in understanding the experiences of Black women. So starting out with broadening participation, the impetus to broadening participation is focused on understanding the challenges faced by women, less on those faced by minorities and really on those for whom those identities intersect. And again, I think Dr. Pearson did a really great job of helping us to think about and kind of ground the experiences of Black women as distinct. And there's an assumption inherent in the broadening participation literature around the pipeline, right? And part of the assumption is that women and minorities are passive. And if we could just find a way to better carry them along from one stage to the next, the problem of underrepresentation and steep attrition would be solved. This frame, in my view, is incomplete for a host of reasons, because it doesn't consider some really important things. And here I want to turn to the sociological literature for a second and introduce the language of a racial frame. And Joe Fagan, a noted sociologist, describes the white racial frame as affecting most Americans. And it's becoming the country's dominant frame of mind and frame of reference in regard to racial matters. And what it is a worldview that encompasses a broad and persistent set of racial stereotypes, prejudices, and ideologies. So it's a racial frame. And frames, in the case of a picture, shape how we see and understand the world. So hold racial frames for a second, and I want to take you over to understand controlling images. So controlling images is a theory introduced by Dr. Patricia Hill Collins, another sociologist. And it's the idea, a generalized ideology of domination, stereotypical images of Black womanhood that take on special meaning. These controlling images are designed to make racism, sexism, poverty, and other forms of social injustice appear to be natural, normal, and inevitable parts of everyday life. And you may be pausing for a moment and saying, what does that have to do with where we started? Racism is the problem. I want to argue for you that it's critical that we focus on the intersections for those reasons, because racial frames shape how we see and move through the world. And because controlling images shape how we understand and experience and interact with Black women, those two frames are shaping the experiences of Black women in science. And focusing on the intersections illuminates the challenges that are shared by women and by minorities. It exposes the inequality that's endemic to the culture of science by highlighting how race exacerbates difference. And it illustrates clearly the role of constraints in shaping the choice to leave or stay in science, challenging the pipeline assumption that's behind the scenes, right? That they're passive, that if we could just find a way to get more into the pipeline, they'll stay. And history and past practice has shown that to not be true. So let's introduce the road. Let's think about this differently. The pipeline metaphor doesn't ask who leaks and why. And we have to recognize that the choices that individuals make to remain in or leave science are not free, in quotes, right? We need to better articulate ideas of agency and constraint in shaping experiences in science. And I want to offer an image of a road with exits, pathways, and potholes. Some people leave, some people journey on, and some get stuck. And let's look and think about why that matters, right? Is that road and the pipeline in the ways that we conceived it before stable or dynamic, right? In the ways that we've thought about the pipeline in the past, we got to ask some questions. Is the pipeline the same for all groups? Is the entry point wider for men and narrower for women? Is the entry point wider for the majority versus minoritized groups? And are the exit points wider for women and minoritized groups? And is there only one entry site or are there multiple? And how much does it matter where you get on and truly where you get off? So all of these things are important for us to think about the stability and the dynamic nature of the pipeline. And I think the road offers us a solution to get out of this. So to make this concrete, I want to talk about Black women in computing. And I want to talk about them along three dimensions. One is constraint, right? Policing belonging. I want to switch to presumptions of ignorance, right? That touch on some themes in kind of an individualistic frame that Dr. Pearson raised. And then I want to switch to agency, right? Persistence despite isolation and hostility, because it's important for us to understand this entire frame that racism is the problem. Where Dr. Pearson ended was there was a love of science. There's an excitement about science. There is frustration about the experience in science. And so we need to just couple those things to move us forward. The data I'm going to share with you, some is drawn from a study done and funded by the Coalition to Diversify Computing in partnership with Dr. Jamika Burge. All right, so let's start off. Just like one of the guys is the way that I frame this quote by Betty, one of our participants. And she says, I had done computer science stuff my whole life. My dad being a professor, we had a computer in our home. I would do basic computer programming, as in BASIC, the computer language. And I'd play games. I was very comfortable with computers. And I use this quote here because I want to normalize the excitement that we associate with science, right? The narrative of early tinkering that dominates kind of the conversations about who does science and why we need to expose or broaden participation of some groups. That's true for Black women too. They are not monolithic in the sense that they are just a group to be brought in as opposed to a group that's already in science. But I want to switch to help you think about the way that that early excitement for science can be policed and challenged. And I'm starting here with a bachelor's degree. This is the story of Melissa, and it comes out of research done by Lynette Kavasny and teams, published in a paper called Power Relations in IT Education and Work, the Intersectionality of Gender, Race, and Class. And she relays the story and the experience of Melissa, and these are Melissa's words. They assumed that I grew up in some crack den somewhere, because I'm from Brooklyn, New York. They assumed that I was there because of affirmative action. And it was just the most hostile racial environment that I've ever been in my life. I do not have fond memories of college. I was called the N-word for the first time there. I was physically assaulted by a woman in my dorm. I was ridiculed by the boyfriend of a girl in my hall. You know, the guys in the car called me the N-word from their car driving on campus. And I was just not used to that, even though I went to schools that were predominantly white. So again, go back to Betty's excitement about science, the idea of going forward, and then entering an academic environment to further your studies, to take your next steps, and your belonging, your very presence is questioned. But it's not just the presence in the abstract, it's the experience, right? It's your actual belonging. So I want to switch gears to Mariah. Mariah recalls her experience in graduate school, and this is her story. When I was a grad student at Green, and I went to a lab that only graduate students could go to do some work. And I walk into the lab, and there's a lab assistant there who's also a grad student. He looked at me come in, and I sit down and I start working. And he comes up to me and he says, I believe you're in the wrong place. And I looked at him and I said, no, I'm not. I keep working, right? So then I'm all right. He's getting a little agitated and he says to me again, I believe you're in the wrong place. And I'm not upset because I'm thinking, okay, there's no one who looked like me, who's ever been in this lab before, who's ever attended this university before. So he really believed. And he's never seen me before. So he really believed I'm in the wrong place. And I'm trying to look at it from his perspective, but I say to him again, no, I'm not. And I keep working. So then he gets a little frustrated. He gets a little bit ahead and starts spewing a few things to me. And then he says, who's your advisor? And I told him who my advisor was, who, by the way, is very powerful on that campus. And then he began to get nervous. And then he apologized to me. I'm so sorry. I just didn't know. I said to him, that's all right. I said, the next time someone who looks like me comes in here or you see them, don't be so sure of yourself. So again, she was physically out of place in a place, a lab where grad students are supposed to work. So let's switch, right? So those are kind of abstract contextual moments, but I want to get to the impact of hostility. So in this narrative, Betty, who we met before, who was really excited about computing, had been involved in it her whole life, describes her PhD experience. She says, again, it was almost an attacking environment. I was getting sick just about every 6 weeks, and I couldn't really figure out why. But once I left, I wasn't getting sick anymore. The thing is that there were professors who warned me before I went. They said, we've never had a Black PhD come out of that department. More context. And so now we've got, those are our constraints, right? Those are the experience of race and racism shaping interactions in the pursuit of education for science. But another thing is happening here. This is Presumptions of Ignorance. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Again, drawing on the paper by Lynette Kavasny, this is the bachelor's student experience. Melissa again. So you're in a physics class and people are choosing lab partners and you're the last ones picked because you're Black. And they assume that you're an idiot. This was Physics 21, which was the most failed class for engineers at my college. It was a 4-credit course. I got an A minus. And I remember the first exam, the average, it was a 125-point exam, and the average was 68. And so they were passing the exams around, and I got 103. So the highest grade in the class. And the shock on the white students' faces when they saw, because they literally assumed that I was an idiot. Mariah, returning to Mariah again, the PhD experience. I didn't really think much about male versus female until I went to Wilson. Again, names have been changed. And the white women were rejecting me. And I'm like, what is this? For me, it wasn't about gender for the most part early on, or even race. But even when I went to grad school, it was about race because it was in my face. It was the other people who would come to me, reacting to me and telling me things, and they clearly didn't know me from Adam. They didn't know my skills and abilities. So I assumed it was my race or my gender or both. I don't know. At the beginning of every semester, you had to come together and be a part of a team to work on your projects for the course. And it never failed. Every single class, after the beginning of the first class, there's a second class. People are trying to form their teams. My fellow classmates, including the women, would look at me up and down from my hair to my toes at least twice and say, no. The thing is, this isn't a new experience. And so Vivica, another participant, says, I remember being in second grade and we had gotten some test results back. And I remember her saying that she was going to tell the teacher that I cheated. And I couldn't understand why she was saying that. And so I asked her, I said, well, why would you say that? Because I didn't cheat. And she said, well, there's no way that a Black kid can make the highest grade in the class. You had to have cheated. Or I had another friend. She was actually my best friend. Her name was Laura. And I remember her saying, I used to think all Black people were dumb until I met you. So it was like there were things like that that happened at a very young age to let me know that there was something that these people thought was different about me. And yet they persisted. And so how? Let's talk about persistence despite isolation. This is a story of Rhonda. Rhonda says, there wasn't a lot of Black and Latino people. There weren't a lot of females. And I was like, why are they not staying? Just stick it out, you know? Even my college roommate, she went from computer science to math. And I was like, Tasha, stick it out, you know? But they wouldn't stick it out. And I'm like, you just gotta stick it out, you know? You can't be worried about what they think or what they say or how they treat you. You just gotta do the work because your work will stand for itself. So no one would believe me. So they just kind of left. And I was like, well, I'm sticking it out. I don't care what you guys are doing. I'm gonna stick this out. I know I can't stick this out. So it was more or less like a challenge to myself to finish every class, you know? Became friends with some other students in college. We'd form little groups every now and then, and we'd be in the lab, you know, working some project of the code. And I was able to tell dirtier jokes than the guys. It was an experience. It was an experience, Rhonda says. So how do we put this all together? I want you to think about Black women in computing and persistence from a frame of agency. The women I profiled here shared several traits, and there were many, many more. This is the aggregation for you. They shared traits in common that facilitated their success and resistance to the culture of STEM. One was early exposure to science. They had familial support and encouragement to pursue computing. They had extremely high levels of pre-college achievement. And so a point Dr. Pearson made before, a larger portion went to an HBCU for their undergraduate training before attending a PWI institution for the PhD. And that had a bit of a protective effect, although it was not, it didn't mean that they didn't experience challenges in those environments too. They shared a level of unabashed confidence that allowed them to deflect the negativity in their environment and to seek help and resources and communities from others that enabled them to go forward. And that last bullet really is key because that network of professionals, professors, and other minorities within and across fields that help to reinforce their worth despite messages to the contrary. And so for the women, and in this case, I will loop in men, Black, that you see persisting in science, there is a level of work beyond the science itself that is critical to their success. And the aim of this project is to show you what that work looks like and make it visible, because the constraints are things we don't talk enough about. There is a severe underrepresentation of women in science. We know that. We know science has a male-dominated culture. But one of the things I want to highlight is this experience of perceived meritocracy alongside pervasive inequality. And again, in the case of my pre-presenter, he walked you through lots of ways in which that manifests and the consequences of that inequality, depending on the kind of institution that you're in, if we just use HBCUs as an example. Two other things that I want to highlight for you as constraints that I didn't go as deeply into in the narratives of the women that I shared. One is lab dynamics. Let's think about that in particular as a way of conditioning and constraining expectations, shaping experiences of racial hostility, right? Exclusion from lab groups when you're the only person of color, and for the Black woman, vulnerability to sexual harassment. Like both of those things are real constraints that are shaping how and when Black women are experiencing and navigating science. And then the last, I'm going to come back to this idea of the pipeline and why the pipeline itself, that frame, is a problem. In its focus, in the passivity of it, we miss all the complexity I just shared with you. Agency and constraint are at all times shaping experiences. And by focusing on gender simply, we're constraining our ability to see nuance and how people experience and navigate inequality in the culture of STEM and in IT more specifically. And I want to close with this, which is that changing the culture of science and moving from diversity as an aim to a reality recognizes requires the recognition of racism as the problem, right? It's not race, it's racism. Racism, not scientific ability or affinity, is what shaped the entry, the exit, and the persistence of women in computing for Black women. So the call in this conversation and in the work as we go forward is to take instances and the challenge that racism plays seriously. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Branch. We appreciate your illumination of how racism plays out at the individual level. We'll now turn to Dr. Graves.
Okay, I'm wondering if, yes, so people can see my screen now. I'm gonna need a moment to gather myself, simply because I have experienced all the things that the last two speakers on my panel have described. And so listening to it sort of, I sort of knew that I was gonna have to listen to that, but when you listen to it, it influences, how you're able to process. So before I start sharing my presentation, I'm gonna move out of my screen. So I hope you can hear my voice so that you can see my research group. And this group, this picture is from attending the 2018 Congress of the NSF Science Technology Center Biocomputational Evolution in Action, known as Beacon. And quite frankly, I'm sure most people in this audience have never experienced that many persons of African descent together in one place at a premier research conference in this field. And I want you to also note from that picture the number of women. In fact, my research group is typically 60 to 70% African-American women. So having said that, now I'm going to share my screen and begin my conversation with you all today. So I've been asked to talk about race and the enterprise of science. So some of you may have seen my open letter with Eric Jarvis that was printed in The Scientist in July, August, after George Floyd was murdered. And quite frankly, as if you remember that moment, there were a lot of statements made by scientific organizations about institutional and structural racism. And it is ironic that it took an African-American man losing his life in such a horrific way on national television to get scientific societies to start thinking about something they've always known was real, and that is structural racism within the discipline and the enterprise of science. So I distinguish the enterprise of science from the scientific method itself. In the best of all worlds, the scientific method allows us to generate objective knowledge about nature and reality. That's why we are scientists. That's what we want to do. But at the same time, we don't do this just for the sake of pursuing knowledge. And I can't believe that anyone listening to this conversation today is as naive to think that our enterprise is simply about objectively trying to find knowledge for knowledge's sake. This knowledge has always been applied, and it's always been applied in a social, historical, cultural context for a purpose. And in the United States, that purpose has always been closely aligned with white supremacy. And this is something that scientists are beginning to have a greater understanding of how what they do in their day-to-day context of their work has been and is still is supporting white supremacy. Now, I think I just talked about that, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. So, you know, the worst examples of science used for nefarious processes are generally well known, and they're really low-hanging fruit. But I'm going to recount some of them just for people who may not know this history. So, for those of you that read, you know, Stephen Jay Gould's classic work, The Mismeasure of Man, he talked about some of the greatest scientists of the 19th century, greatest natural scientists of the 19th century, and their alliance to the scientific theory of polygeny. Now, polygeny held that there were different lineages of human beings, and that the socially defined races were in fact not races in the biological sense, but actually separate species. And this was the worldview of 19th century naturalists. Although, if you read my book, The Emperor's New Clothes, you'll know that that wasn't the consensus in the 18th century. And so it was a consolidation of chattel slavery, particularly in the United States and the British colonial empire, that drove the ascendancy of polygeny. And it had real societal influences, such as the views of Chief Justice Roger Taney, who decided in 1857 in the Dred Scott case that Dred Scott was no different from chairs or other chattel, and therefore was not a citizen of the United States and had no rights. And he reified in that decision African inferiority. And he did that based upon the thinking of luminary scientists such as Samuel Morton, Louis Agassiz, who was a founder of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. And shortly after polygeny, Spencerism, which most people call social Darwinism, and again in my book, I call it Spencerism because it actually had little to nothing to do with the evolutionary ideas of Charles Darwin. In fact, Darwin knew Spencer and thought he was an idiot. Psychometry, the work of Galton and his descendants, to the modern day, psychometry is still a thing for those of you who are unaware, and it is still, for a large degree, based in racial thinking. In fact, last year I was asked to review a paper for a journal called Psych, in which the author was presenting the winter selection hypothesis for greater intelligence of Eurasians compared to sub-Saharan Africans. And despite my critique of the assumptions in the paper, the journal went ahead and published it anyway. It was as if everything I wrote in that review was completely ignored. Eugenics, the work of Charles B Davenport, who was a member of the American Eugenics Society and also what we would call the Society, American Society of Geneticists. And T.H. Morgan knew Davenport. They were friends. he recognized that Davenport's ideas were wrong, but never spoke out against them. The number of examples of the terrible things the Eugenics Record Office did. Most of you may not be aware of their role in the pellagra hearings. Pellagra was a disease caused by nutritional deficiency, particularly vitamin K12. But the Eugenics Record Office convinced the Congress of the United States that it was a heritable genetic disease. And in part, close to 70,000 Americans died when an intervention could have been made that would have saved their lives. Their ideas on race crossing and the inferiority of the hybrids, and the case that most of you probably remember is the sterilization of Carrie Buck. But many of you don't know that the model eugenical sterilization law led to the sterilization of 67,000 Americans against their will, not just Carrie Buck. Again, most of you are familiar with the work of the Nazi race scientists, Eugen Fischer, Fritz Lenz, Freiherr von Verschuer, but you're probably not familiar with the fact that all of these men who contributed to the death camps were acquitted at the Nuremberg war crimes and allowed to be denazified and to continue their work as respected scientists in their fields in anthropology and genetics. Biological warfare. The microbiologist Shiro Ishii, who was the general who commanded Unit 731 and brought biological warfare into the 20th century. Now, these techniques had been used before, and Shiro Ishii perfected them. And similarly to Eugen Fischer and Fritz Lenz, after the war, Shiro Ishii walked free, even though he infected human beings with smallpox, anthrax, and other pathogens in China. And the reason he walked free was because the United States government wanted to know what Shiro Ishii knew about biological warfare. And so he was never prosecuted. The nuclear arms race. The relationship between the discipline of astrophysics and the military-industrial complex is well explained in Tyson and Lang's Accessory to War, the unspoken alliance between astrophysics and the military. Now, I remember being a senior in Oberlin College, and I talked to one of my physicist friends about his work. And I said, well, you know, Arthur, how can you work on building weapons of mass destruction? And his response to me was, well, you know, if I don't do it, these things won't work. And my response to him was, well, that's a really good thing. I'm very happy for them not to work. So now, throughout the last two presentations, there have been discussion of institutional factors which make it difficult for persons who are not of European descent to pursue careers in science, including at the undergraduate, the graduate level, and as faculty members at their institutions. The numbers that I put on the screen are based on Wikipedia, so they may not be accurate for 2019, but I think they're pretty close with regard to the annual Federal Research Awards by the top 10 universities as determined by US News and World Report. Their endowment numbers are in the right-hand corner. Spelman College, which was ranked #1 for HBCUs, and it's sort of strange that a college was ranked #1 compared to these research universities, has an endowment of $390 million. No research funds were available for them. My institution, North Carolina A&T, has an endowment of $68.4 million, and we annually turn out about $64 million in federal research funding. And by the way, that ranks us #3 in the UNC system after North Carolina State and UNC Chapel Hill, something that most people don't know. But when you look at these numbers compared to just the top 10 historically white institutions whose enrollment of undergraduates, African-American undergraduates, goes from anywhere from 3 to 8% annually. African-American faculty in the sciences at these institutions are probably 1 to 3% in the traditional STEM fields. And think about the fact that the majority of African-American undergraduates are enrolled at historically Black universities and colleges that receive only 8% annually of all federal research funding. This is an infrastructural difference that historically Black institutions will never be able to make up. And this requires one having a simple understanding of basic competition theory. So even if you used a simple model like the Latka-Volterra competition equations in ecology, you could modify that to talk about the gain in wealth for institutions relative to one another. And just doing the math demonstrates that it is literally impossible in this system for historically Black institutions to ever catch up with the historically white institutions. It's a game that is impossible for us to win. And therefore, it makes it extremely difficult, based upon the ideas that have already been presented to you by the last two speakers, for African-American students to ever enter the game on a level playing field with their European-American colleagues. Now, after the low-hanging fruit that I began this talk with, I want to talk about something that may not be obvious to people. And so I've spent a great deal of time, I'm going to try to move my control panel over to the right. Yeah, there we go. So I've spent a great deal of time thinking about a modern example of the enterprise of science operating to benefit people of European descent in the United States in ways that those people just don't realize. And so one topic that has continued to be problematic in this regard is biomedical research addressing issues of race. And I've written extensively about this, so a list of some of my publications here, but all of my analysis operates from the starting point that biomedical research views people of African descent as being genetically sick. So in other words, while these individuals may realize that environmental effects do exist, their thinking has always been driven by the idea it's the underlying genetic difference that is most responsible for the health disparities that we see in complex disease in the United States. So, and this goes back to the very beginning of medicine in the United States. Most of you may be aware that the founding of medicine in this country was facilitated by the ease of access to enslaved bodies. There are all sorts of horrific examples, so I'm not going to go through them, including Joseph Lewis, who peeled the skin from the body of a deceased Black man named Cato and boiled him to get his skeleton and used his skin to make the case for his medical instruments, and all sorts of horrific examples like this. Ideas about medicine and differences between biological races were influenced by polygenism. And so here are some examples. For example, in 1799, it was thought that Africans and Europeans generally suffered from the same diseases and disabilities. However, some of these were unique to Africans. In that same year, Harvey and Lindsay described a disease called cachexia africana, or dirt eating, which was associated with emotional distress and depression. In 1826, Tiedemann explained that the darker skin of Africans allowed them to withstand heat in humid conditions better than Europeans, and that in fact was true. In 1850, Samuel Cartwright, the South Carolina physician, described Negro consumption, which was different from white consumption somehow. I seem to remember that tuberculosis killed people pretty much the same way, but Cartwright thought differently. He also coined the disease drapetomania, which Gould talked about in his book, Mismeasure of Man, or the irrational desire of Negroes to run away. Dysthesia, a disease that caused slaves to perform tasks in a haphazard manner. But these ideas made it through into the 21st century. So I was particularly motivated by Sally Seitel's opinion piece, I Am a Racially Profiling Doctor, which appeared in the New York Times on May 5th of 2002. And she says, in practicing medicine, I am not colorblind. I always take note of my patient's race. So do many of my colleagues. We do it because certain diseases and treatments responses cluster by ethnicity. Now, these ideas are still present in medical training and those who become physicians. This is from a paper that was published in PNAS in 2016, a survey done at the University of Virginia's medical school, demonstrating false beliefs held by medical students when they arrived for medical training. So first-year medical students, a third of them believed that blacks aged more slowly than whites. About a tenth of them believed that black nerve endings were less sensitive than white nerve endings. Half of them believed that black blood coagulated more quickly than whites. More than a half, 63.5%, thought that black skin was thicker than white skin. A third of them thought that blacks have stronger immune systems than white. Now, in UVA, they were able to demonstrate that their curriculum did reduce some of these false beliefs by the time their students were in their third year, but many of their residents who came from other medical programs held these views very strongly, such as black ages more slowly than whites, black skin is thicker than whites, and so forth. So a lot of this comes from this long-standing historical mortality difference between persons of African descent and persons of European descent in the United States. And so here you see data from 1963, 1981, 1996, 2004, showing the age-specific mortality ratio from 24 biological mortality sources for persons described as black and white. And you see that these ratios go between 2.5 and 1.5 in the early portion of life and only begin to equalize at later age. And so this is a serious problem which many biomedical researchers have turned their attention to. Similarly, when you look at specific diseases like cancer and heart disease. Now, what's often overlooked is that if you look at all Americans on the basis of household income, you see similar ratios of mortality disparity at lower income. Now, this data was not disaggregated by socially defined race. So I know some of you are saying, well, it may be because most of these people who are in the lower incomes are persons of African and Latino descent. Now, even if that's true, one could still propose that the main driving force for mortality ratio was not genetic, and you have no reason to believe that they necessarily had to be genetic when you have data that tells you that people at low income are more likely to have higher mortality ratios than people who have higher incomes. Now, to understand disease risk, you have to recognize that it's a combination of genetic effects, environmental effects, and chance effects. Now, the diseases that make up the substance of health disparity are governed by the rules of quantitative and not Mendelian genetics. And so if we look at the variance in any phenotype, including disease profiles, they're made up of genetic effects, environmental effects, gene by environmental effects, and also the covariance of genes and environment, along with the error in which you measure these things. And you can combine these to get what we call broad sense heritability, which I'll come back to in a few moments. Now, the most difficult problem that I see in biomedical research is a lack of appreciation for the ubiquity of gene by environment interactions. And in this diagram, I show you an example of different alleles that are associated with a disease in 4 hypothetical environments. Allele 1 is associated with disease in all environments. Allele 2 in 3 out of 4. Allele 3 is associated with disease in 2 out of 4. And allele 4 only is associated with disease in environment D. Now, looking at this, you might get the impression that if you didn't know the association between allele and disease effects, you might get the impression, if you only saw allele 4 in environment D, that it is a causal variant with regard to any disease in question. And this is the problem, because when you consider the fact, and I think I talk about this, when you consider the fact that people of African descent have always lived in challenging environments in the United States, if you're making claims about genetic causality, you're doing so in the context of this challenging environment. These genes may be fine everywhere else, they're just not good when a person is consistently racially subordinated from birth to death. And to give you an example of that, I just saw a report on a lawsuit being brought by players in the NFL who are claiming that their neurocognitive exams are being judged differently compared to persons of European descent with regard to brain injury. And they claim that essentially an African American has to be sicker because the algorithm that's being used to determine cognitive function assumes that the innate cognitive function of whites is higher than the cognitive function of blacks. And so therefore, a lower black cognitive function isn't counted as pathology because it's normal for what the algorithm believes the black brain should look like. And there are other examples of this, including the EGFR kidney function tool that is calibrated differently for blacks and white, again, resulting in a black patient needing to be sicker to qualify for specialized care. Now, both of these errors result from conflating socially defined race with biological variation. Similarly, we can show that the heritability of lifespan itself is lower for persons of African descent. And this again speaks to the fact that for African Americans in this pathologic environment, their genetic potential actually contributes less to their potential lifespan than that of Caribbean Hispanics and European Americans in this study that was conducted in New York City. Other studies show that African immigrants who don't show the same patterns of disease burden in their native countries pick up those patterns of disease once they come to the United States. And I list several studies below indicating that. Now, I want to end on 2 slides which demonstrate how anti-theoretic this approach has been. So if you actually look at the genome of persons of African descent and the persons of European descent, it turns out that more deleterious genetic variation exists in Europeans compared to Africans. And so if you were solely making a genetic argument for predisposition to complex disease, then you should have assumed that persons of European descent were the genetically sick people and not persons of African descent. But that's the predominant paradigm that exists in biomedical research, is that persons of African descent are the genetically sick ones. Now, how would you actually determine if there really was genomic contributions to these complex diseases that differ between socially defined races? Well, the best way to do that would be to do a classical ecological and evolutionary transplant experiment, where you would take individuals from both of these groups and transplant them into each other's environment. Now, obviously, transplanting European Americans into a toxic environment is ethically not supportable. In other words, you would have to have generations of European Americans who were socially subordinated or enslaved, went through Jim Crow and mass incarceration, were a numerical minority. And this is one of the reasons why none of these sociological methods of trying to normalize by various, environmental and social parameters actually works, because they never take into account the fact that African Americans and other racialized minorities are always that, a minority in a society whose cultural hegemony is based upon European norms.
Joe,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
so sorry to interrupt. We're over time.
Yeah, this is literally the last sentence.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
you'd have to have differential exposure to environmental toxins and so on. So if you did this and you found genetic variants that were associated with disease, then you could actually say that, oh, these variants really are causing disease. But we've never done that. And so therefore, the entire paradigm of biomedical research associated with health disparity is fundamentally flawed.
I want to thank Dr. Pearson and Dr. Branch and Dr. Graves. I'm sorry we don't have time for conversation. I'm sure it would be a wonderful one. But I want to thank them for taking the time to explain once again what the situation is, something that Black Americans are asked to do far too often. Thank you for these extremely provocative and interesting talks. And I'm sure that people will go home to their institutions and try to keep this conversation going. So thank you again.